Okay, good afternoon, everybody in the audience. There are more than 150 people registered for this session, which is very good, even also considering that we are at the end of a very busy week. And I think many of you will be tired of joining the conference so far with all its very good quality content. So we will try to put up with that and to finalize it on a very high note. So that means welcome to the session on new challenges ahead, AI and society. And I'm quite proud to have this wonderful set of people to present to you. The title of this session is New Challenges Ahead, AI and Society, and that is a very broad title. So that is why we chose to approach the topic from the 4 different angles that are included in the quadruple helix. So that is also why we chose these 4 people to introduce the topic to you. The first one is Tijmen Wisman from the Platform of Civil Rights in the Netherlands. He's also an assistant professor at the Free University of Amsterdam. Then we have and he's representing the societal views on the topic. Then we asked Susan Levy of the University College of Dublin to represent the academic vision on what AI means for society. And her background is mostly gender studies and bias-related topics. And this is, as you all know, a very important aspect of using AI. We then have the industry perspective, and that is Brandon Rowan, who is from the Blue Specs company. And he is very much involved in the implementation of AI systems. And then lastly, Gianluca Musuraka, who has quite a number of different affiliations, but the one that we used to ask him to be in this panel is that he has been a very distinguished member of the Joint Research Council, the JRC. So he's representing the governmental perspective. And then we have my colleague, Joachim de Greef, who is a senior consultant in the data science department, and which completely coincidentally is also my affiliation. I also work with TNO. I'm quite active in the BDVA, and I'm working in the same research group as Joachim. To give you an overview of what we are going to do today, this is the introduction. I will be delivering it. Time to address the societal view, then Susan on the academic perspective, Brendan representing industry, and Gianluca the government perspective. And then, assuming that all of the speakers manage to stay within the time limits, they only have 15 minutes each. And we prepared to have 10 minutes of introduction and then 5 minutes of interaction. So that will leave us with some 20 minutes for a panel discussion. Throughout all presentations, you are very kindly invited to use the chat window on the right of your screen to ask questions or to make comments. This is the only way of interacting. So I will be reading those chat messages and I will forward the questions to the speakers after their contribution. And of course, also during the panel discussion, we will start off with some questions that we have prepared already, but we really invite the audience to also contribute there and to ask their questions. And then it will be 3 o'clock, and then we are at the end of a very interesting but also very tiring week. So then it's time to wrap up. Before we go to the introductions to the speakers, we would like first to have a little bit of trying out what we think of this topic. And we have prepared a number of questions that they are not very original questions. They pop up regularly, but still we are very much interested to see what is the average opinion of the audience with respect to these questions. So if you can go to the well-known menti.com website and use the code 97298097, you are invited to answer these questions. You can use your mobile device to do this, or you can use your browser in another tab, of course, otherwise you will lose this session, to go to these questions and to answer them. So the first question is a very well-known one, but it's still not resolved. So we are curious to know, when an autonomous vehicle causes an accident, who's responsible? And this is, of course, thinking of a little bit into the future when we have really autonomous vehicles, because it is new challenges ahead. We're talking about the future here. So who do you think is or should be responsible? The driver or the owner, the manufacturer of the car, or the supplier of the AI module, or a very interesting last possibility, maybe this is just bad luck. We don't accept bad luck anymore in our modern society, but maybe this is one of those cases where bad luck may be needed as a new concept for us. Okay, we will reflect on your answers, and we will go to the second question, and that is a comparison with the Industrial Revolution. In the Industrial Revolution, machines have automated a lot of physical work, and many people are also expecting, or we already see this, that AI will automate mental work as well. And observing that the majority of jobs in our current society involves mental work, you could think, what happens when this will be the subject of automation using AI? Is that no problem? Or does it mean that we need a fundamental rearrangement in how we look at our economy, how we look at our society? Or will this be a situation that we can gradually adapt to, just like the Industrial Revolution has created new types of jobs that nobody could imagine upfront, but that we still have these days? So we are very curious to find out what you think of this. And the third question is on bias. You probably all know that algorithms or machine learning models or AI can have biases, and you can say that these biases are built in because society itself is biased, and all data that you extract from society will thus also be biased. So is this something bad? Because we should AI to be unbiased even when society itself is biased, so the usage of AI is a means to improve? Or do you say, well, it's acceptable because it reflects our current society, and just as a parliament should reflect society, the tools that we're using like AI should also reflect current society? Or maybe it's even good, provided that AI is also able to tell us, hey, this is the bias that I have in my models. It really helps us to understand our own biases, and maybe will help us to point towards those parts in society that we need to improve on. Again, we're very curious to find out, and we invite the speakers, of course, to reflect on your votes. The last question is on training and understanding AI. It's very often identified that in order to have responsible deployment and usage of AI, it is very much important that people have a basic understanding of AI. Just as you know how a car works, not to the degree of a mechanical engineer. We cannot repair our own cars, but when the car stops working, we first check whether there's still enough gas in it, and then we check whether the battery is low or not, or we check for a flat tire. We have this basic conceptual understanding of what a car does. So maybe we should also have a basic conceptual understanding of what AI can do and what it cannot do. So who is responsible to help society understand AI? Is it government? Is it mainly the tech companies that are using AI and that are also then making a profit by using AI? Or is it really a responsibility of the people themselves to get a better understanding of AI, and so to help themselves to better play a role in our current society? So again, we are asking you to give your opinion on these four questions, so that we have a possibility to reflect on it during the 4 presentations that we will be having. after this. And because we are now in the strange situation that the broadcast through the B2Match platform has a 30 seconds delay after the recording of our contributions, which is done in a separate platform, I need to fill in this gap by continuing to talk for 30 seconds before we have the actual outcomes of the voting available. And behind the screen, Joachim is now working on the collection of the results of your voting. And when those results are available, he will be sharing his screen and he will briefly comment on the outcomes of the voting. So
yes, Freek. So I think we are done with the voting. I will share the results. So that will hopefully work. So here we have the outcome. So there were not that many votes. I don't know whether people had a little bit trouble finding the voting mechanism, or maybe it's at the end of the week. Nevertheless, for the first question, who is responsible in automated vehicles? Yeah, the majority think the manufacturer of the car, even though it's not that many votes, but there is the majority. And yeah, I could speculate a little bit on that, because that is you would think that there lies the most knowledge about how the autonomous cars are actually moving. So you sort of expect that the manufacturer is the best position to be able to make that sort of judgment, as the driver really doesn't know, or the supplier of the AI module also doesn't really know how it would be used. But of course, this is a bit debatable. And yeah, I think we also invite the speakers later on to reflect on this. The second question was, let's see, whether or not it's a problem that eventually machines might also replace mental work, what that requires for society. Yeah, majority does think that the fundamental rearrangement for this is needed, even though also maybe some gradual adaptation might be possible, but probably we do need to think about what that means for society, and what kind of fundamental aspects are not yet in line with this expected automation. The third question, sorry, about AI systems magnifying existing biases in society. Yeah, that's sort of divided in the sense that some people think that this is really bad, and we can expect AI to be really unbiased, even though we know society as itself is biased. But also some voices think that it might actually be good, because it could help us understand how biased we are and potentially then remedy it. So it's a bit divided there. And the last question, who is primarily responsible for actually understanding AI? Quite divided indeed. Yeah, I think you can make a number of stances here. Ultimately, you could argue that government should at least make it possible, or try to educate all of society for that one, give everybody the means. But ultimately, people would also probably need themselves to sort of take action and think what it means for yourself, for your own life. So yeah, I do hope we provided a bit of thought here, and we can see what the speakers will, how they will react on this.
Yeah, thank you, Joachim. Thank you. Yeah, so even though it is only a small number of votes, so we do not have statistical accuracy here. I still think it's interesting that there is quite some divided opinions on this. So I really look forward to hear the views and opinions of Tijmen Wisman on this topic. So Tijmen, can you share your views with us and take some 10 or 15 minutes for your message? So please go ahead, Tijmen.
Okay, thank you, Freek, for first of all for inviting me to have a little talk here on your event. So my name is Tijmen Wisman. I work as an assistant professor at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam on privacy and data protection. I'm a lawyer, and I also work for the Platform for Civil Rights, for which I'm the chairman, and I'm sitting here today in that last capacity. From the first capacity, I'm interested in society and how, basically, what sort of society do we want to live in, which is very much dependent on how we actually implement technology. And there's a phrase that I really like. It's from Mitch Caper. He's the frontman of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and in which he says, architecture is politics. And architecture is politics, meaning that the way you build things has a very important influence in power relations. And power relations is basically, for me, the main topic of AI. And from a societal perspective, from the perspective of a citizen who is basically wondering what the hell we are doing, this is also the most fundamental question. What are we building? How is it going to affect relationships? And how can we guarantee that these relationships are fair and governed and how I start to say governing myself, but basically we talk also about how we are limited, how do we limit power within these relationships so that we do not get a government which is almighty. This is not a new question. So throughout the centuries, there have been constitutional lawyers thinking about these questions, and actually through political as well as popular fights, coming to a point of having constitutional rights, which are intended to be, which you could view as architectural principles of how to build society. So in that sense, you can say that lawyers are early architects, but nowadays also the lawyers who are actually have a view of what is happening within society are saying, well, actually the big architectural choices are now taken outside of the realm of law, because these also happen within the practice of government, which is where certain data-driven and AI systems are being deployed. So it becomes extra important to ask the question, okay, what sort of boundaries are we going to place on the power of the state? And when people come under scrutiny of the state, what sort of means do we give them to defend themselves? This brings me to my second, the capacity in which I'm sitting here as a chairman for the Platform for Civil Rights. Because with the platform, we actually challenged the state for using Siri. And I don't mean your, the assistant of your smartphone, but I'm talking about Siri, which is an acronym for System Risk Indication. And Siri was is a system which was deployed by the Ministry of Social Affairs, and in which different public authorities could work together and bring their data together at a third party and data of an entire neighborhood, for example, citizens, and then scan this data on the basis of a risk model to see whether there were higher citizens who are at a higher risk of violating certain laws pertaining to welfare fraud, violation of labor laws, and violation of tax laws. So a very broad area. And within this court case, the court actually held that it was difficult to comprehend how citizens can defend themselves against a risk report, because risk reports were the things that could roll out of this scan, a risk report on a citizen, which could be viewed as an interinstitutional dossier of a citizen. So how a citizen could defend himself against or herself against a risk report, which he or she is not aware of, and which is created on the basis of a secret risk model with secret input. And the court decided that a citizen should be capable of defending her or himself against that, but that nowadays that is not the case. And within the law that was the law which was institutionalizing the practice of Siri, this possibility was not within the law. And the good thing is we won this court case. It got a lot of attention, also international, within the Guardian and the New York Times. So we had a thing to be sort of proud of. But then a strange thing happened. The day after the state could appeal the decision, to appeal the decision of the court. So they couldn't appeal the decision anymore. Then they proposed a law which actually goes much further, and in which there is no transparency whatsoever towards citizens, and in which private-public data processing partnerships can make blacklists of citizens, in which incriminating dossiers of them are euphemistically dubbed information products. So if this law will make it through now it's with the Senate, each Dutch citizen can become an information product. And within the data processing partnerships, it are not only public authorities, but it are also private parties who can start collaborating. So the thing that we can learn from this is that basically when a court draws a line on the basis of human rights, so rights which are recognized in international treaties, so which are the highest constitutional value, that we have a government who just bulldozes over that line and basically ignores the fact that this ever happened. And generally, we can see that legislators are working very hard nowadays to change the laws in order to facilitate a gradual expansion of information power of the state. And in the process, they're forgetting the basic principles and the architectural principles that we build our society on. Democracy, like Karl Popper once said, is about limiting power. And we see that the shift to data-driven governance is one in which the power of the state is continuously increased. The point of departure of constitutional democracy is to institutionalize distrust towards the state. But the thing that we're doing now is basically we're creating laws which allow the institutionalization of distrust against citizens. And this is very problematic. Because the law on data processing by partnerships is not very easy to stick to anyone's brain, we actually renamed this law with a platform, and we now call it super serie. And super serie is also the term which is being used by parliamentarians even. And despite the fact that this new law is evidently in breach of human rights and constitutional rights, it is now actually in the final stage of the legislative process. And our highest advisory body, the Council of State, also indicated that it is still in breach of constitutional rights in their last advice. But now it holds that it is crucial that the legislator can trust on a professional practice. Basically, they're saying, well, you can still accept the law. You have to make a few changes, maybe later on. But they say, as long as the legislator can trust on professional practice. And this should not depend on rules, but on professionalism on the work floor. And this is very dubious, because the architectural principles that I'm talking about are all about limiting the powers before you actually give the powers to the executive branch of the state. You have the legislative branch, you have the judicial branch, and you have the executive branch, the trias politica. But now, basically, the Council of State is saying, well, the law maybe doesn't have to be that precise, but you can limit the powers later on. And I will explain to you why this is a pretty naive stance. In the Netherlands, we had the child benefits affair. And maybe if you come from the Netherlands, you have surely heard of this, because this is hitting the news for already more than a year straight. Even our current government stepped down because of this scandal, but they're still ruling in some strange way, but that's another discussion. For people unfamiliar with it, in the Netherlands, childcare is very expensive, and even when you have a well-paid job, you still receive benefits. In this affair, tax service started claiming in relation to thousands of families that they were not entitled to the money they received and that they had to pay it back. These were large amounts of money which could and did bankrupt families. Thousands of families received these claims whilst they actually didn't do anything wrong, and leaving the impression that their cases have been administered by the tax service. I'm just checking my time. By the tax service on the basis of a risk profile, so basically statistics, instead of any actual wrongdoing. And these people have been effectively placed into a position where they had to prove their innocence, which was possible because they were in conflict with a bureaucratic mastodon which ignored the legal order they were operating in. And in law, if you accuse a person of something, you have to prove it. But the danger of AI and risk profiling is that we start labeling citizens and then load the burden of proof to show that they didn't do something on their shoulders. In the future, this will become even more problematic. I will cut it a little bit short towards the end. And this is now that the EU is actually working on a legislative proposal for AI, in which predictive policing, a practice which data scientists themselves refer to as AI snake oil, is introduced as a legitimate practice. Basically, we're setting up a legal framework in which the child benefits affair will just be considered a failed pilot. And this is not all. In the proposed AI regulation, the use of AI as a polygraph is considered also a high-risk practice. Now, there are already projects in the EU, like border control, in which we use AI as a polygraph. So basically, we have a thing that you download as a migrant, and then you can do an interview with a border guard. This is through an app. And then you have micro gesture analysis. And on the basis of the micro gesture analysis, you get a risk score. And different scientists have actually commented on this and have said, well, this is based on pseudoscience, which is a very neat way of saying this is based on absolutely nothing. But within this AI regulation, we are affording and we are creating powers to say whether you are going to do something in the future and whether you are telling the truth. So these are godlike powers, which shouldn't be in the hands of anybody. Moreover, they are actually not very realistic that they can actually exist effectively, that the AI can do this, but we are still creating these powers. So as a representative of society, my message is that I really have very small trust in the course that AI is going to run. And the problem is also, if you are going to use AI to automate all kinds of processes, to cut costs, if you automate a process for which AI is not suitable, the cost will actually increase. And then this is what we see in the Netherlands with the whole tax service thing, because now actually this thing is going to cost way more than we ever could save on it. To come to a conclusion, it's very short. We need to acknowledge the society in which we deploy AI, and we need to recognize that this is a society in which the deployment of AI will likely disproportionately affect people who cannot afford legal protection. If we recognize the limitations of AI first, we can save ourselves a lot of costs and energy trying to make AI do things which is not suitable for. If we do think that we can use AI against citizens in a certain area, then the use of AI needs to be governed by a law which specifies this power so it is limited and which guarantees the ability of citizens to challenge the findings of the system. I'll leave it at that.
Wow, Tijmen, you really covered a lot of ground here, and that really provides a very interesting starting point for the other presenters to reflect upon. And also maybe the audience to react to. I haven't seen any questions so far, so I will not have the Q&A part of it. But there's at least one insight that I got from you, besides many others. One of the questions said that AI can act as a magnifying glass for existing biases, but you also made it clear that automating things that were normally the realm of mental processes, that is AI, also magnifies intransparencies that are now in the current bureaucracy, because it really makes it much easier to become even more bureaucratic and more intransparent, and that's this child benefits affair thing that you're referring to. So that is something that I hadn't realized before, but you opened my eyes for that. That's interesting to know.
Well, by your wording, you also made me rethink the thing of intransparency. So that's thank you for that.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Tijmen. And yeah, you may have noticed that we're a little bit over time, but it's just 5 minutes, so that's not too problematic. So I'd like to give Susan the floor now to give her reflection on these topics. Susan, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'll just show my screen. Thank you, everyone, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this fantastic event. So I'm Susan Levy from University College Dublin, and my perspective on this would be, I guess, I represent the academic perspective on this. So as we all know, AI is an integral part of our society now, and it's increasingly making decisions about many aspects of our lives. We all know this, and this is especially true for a younger generation. I think where apps on phones and iPads are an integral part, not just of their social life, but of their education from a very early age. So at the moment, AI systems are making decisions for us in, for example, the field of healthcare, policing, finance, and possibly most influentially in terms of societal attitudes and opinions, it is being used for online content curation, and it's thereby shaping our world, and not always in a particularly transparent way. There's great benefits to AI, of course, and great opportunities, particularly in the area of healthcare. But as it stands, there's also serious threats that do need to be considered. The last year's EC white paper on AI, for example, from last year, pointed to the potential of AI to really undermine fundamental human rights. So there's mounting evidence, for instance, of cases of bias and discrimination on the basis of race and gender. So just to go through a few, and probably a lot of these are well known, so I'm just going to give just an overview of a few. So predictive policing, as was mentioned before, there's long been critiques of how such systems could be trained on imperfect data that reflects an imperfect world and could end up, repeating bias and discrimination through its decisions. And just yesterday, a news report analysed Predpol, this system used in the US, and it did a huge analysis of it and found distinctive racial bias, and that confirms what people have been kind of predicting about these systems since 2016. There's in the case of Compass, which is a system used to recommend duration of parole, that's been found to be racially biased. In healthcare, this amazing paper by Zayed Abimer found that one AI system was used widely. It's used widely in the US, and it used past healthcare use as a proxy for healthcare need, and it ended up being racially biased because, as we all know, if healthcare is linked to ability to pay, then just because you can't access healthcare doesn't mean you don't need it. But instead of predicting healthcare need, the AI system was actually predicting ability to pay. But the kind of the healthcare recommendations were coming from this system. So biometric systems as well, facial recognition, they're widely known to work best if your face happens to be white and male. So and possibly the most insidious of all, because of its personalization and lack of transparency is search and recommender systems. They've been shown to be biased in relation to the kind of job ads, for example, that people are shown, but also increasingly there's cases emerging of harmful content being recommended to people. So in each cases of discrimination in AI systems, those that were negatively affected were also those already most marginalized. And this has led to public campaigns and pressure on companies to incorporate ethical AI. And we have proposed EU AI regulation, for example, to address many of these issues. It's clear that there is an urgent need for reform in how AI is developed and used. And without appropriate ethical and regulatory frameworks, there's a real risk that decades of advances in human rights and civil liberties may be undermined. So in addressing this, we have a broad range of measures. There's an awful lot going on. There's ethical frameworks and the EU regulation. We have regulatory bodies, IEEE, ISO, developing professional regulations, and most recently, we have the UNESCO recommendations on the ethics of artificial intelligence. An awful lot going on. But I propose that along with kind of a top-down approach to regulation, there's also a need to develop a kind of virtue ethics among those who design and develop and deploy AI systems. Because like when you look at many of these issues, of injustice in relation to AI, many of these aren't new. Like, there are similar issues that we've encountered before, and there's existing legislation to deal with many of them. Like, think of recruitment bias in who you chose to, show your job ad to. That's kind of emerged before, and we've covered it in existing legislation. So while that law and regulation is essential, there's also another aspect to it that's crucial. That is the vision for social justice and theories that underlie them that have brought around so much change in the past, particularly like if we look at the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s. Often these kinds of issues that we are seeing in AI, were dealt with back then. So we need to use the full suite of measures that have kind of worked in the past to address a lot of the issues in AI. And also, I think in terms of AI itself, I always go back to the foundational goals of AI. And it was a kind of aspiration to replicate human intelligence. It wasn't just to find patterns in data. But if we go back to the vision of AI, like the first iteration of AI was, of course, to focus on replicating problem solving. So, however, a fundamental part of human intelligence relates to ethics, empathy, a social conscious, morality, those kind of concepts and abilities. Our capacity to utilize an ethical code to decide decisions and actions. So to be intelligent, these aspects have to be integrated into the decision-making of a process of an AI algorithm, either through human oversight or as part of the algorithms themselves. And so if we take, for instance, an example of something that brought around significant social change in the past, feminist theory, and we think how these core principles of feminist epistemology could inform the design of AI. Like, just as one perspective to go at this, right? So if we think of the first principle, these are kind of core principles of feminist epistemology. So the first one I want to talk about would dictate that the perspectives of those involved in the design and development of AI systems are embedded in the systems, and they play a central role in the social construction of concepts. So understanding whose perspectives are encoded in the data, like who coded them, who designed it, and who are they, because their worldview is going to be embedded in those systems. So understanding that, and just the simple fact that those affected by bias and discrimination in AI are rarely those involved in developing them. That fact alone is testimony to the importance of understanding, the perspectives of those who design AI. Secondly, the choices we make and how we represent knowledge, that in turn, and knowledge representation is a core part of AI, and that in turn generates social concepts. So it's imperative to take an activist stance in the design of AI. So there's an opportunity with AI to do better than just replicate what we've done in the past. So recognizing that reflexive nature of knowledge inevitably leads to greater responsibility in AI development. Feminist epistemology would assert that knowledge and data is heavily value-laden and influenced by philosophical viewpoints. There's always a philosophical viewpoint, especially when you come to data. And there's no such thing as neutral data. So when you accept that, then you have to, no matter even the possibility of kind of objective data, that you kind of own that there's a theory in data that you are going to replicate through your system. And finally, feminist epistemology calls for the inclusion of knowledge from groups often considered subordinate and other forms of knowledge outside the predominant forms of discourse that can often be marginalized or omitted. And this is becoming more prevalent with calls for participatory AI, for instance. In terms of data, it calls for us to look beyond singular sources and to new different forms of knowledge. And nothing illustrates this point more than the issues we've seen in natural language generation when we use something like all the text on Reddit to train a language generator, and the issues of bias and discrimination that comes from that. From just using such a narrow domain of data. So overall, I propose that along with regulation, theories pertaining to social justice are used to evaluate each stage of the AI development and design and development process. It should become something that's seen as an essential aspect of artificial intelligence itself. So that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I wrote it in the chat as well. I really liked your catchy phrase. There's an opportunity to do better in AI than just replicate the past. I like that very much. That's at least one that I'm try to remember for future usage, if that's okay with you. There are no questions in the chat, but one popped up when I was listening to your presentation, and that is, even though an AI application is legally justified, because we still have in mind Timon's first introduction, even when it is legally justified, people expect AI to be much more accurate than human performance. I've heard from a study in the autonomous vehicles world where they indicated that when a human makes a certain amount of errors, that is accepted, but an AI system should only be accepted when it is at least 5 or 6 times more reliable. That's in terms of accuracy. But in terms of fairness, what do you think? Because people do accept more or less, or at least assume that humans can be biased, but do you think that there will also be a factor 5 or 6 that people will impose on systems to be unfair, or will they even not accept any unfairness at all? What would be your assessment on how much people are willing to accept before they really start to push back on the usage of those systems?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I think our human response to this is interesting and not consistent. So, in certain, I think the issues that have hit the media are when systems have absorbed kind of unjust processes in bureaucracy or whatever and just replicated them, and often it's just algorithms. It's not necessarily AI, but when a system kind of formalizes our own biases, we get horrified. It holds up a mirror to ourselves, really, and I think there's a low tolerance for that, especially when it comes into public policy. We expect that when, in a bureaucracy, there's people who are going to have a bad day and make a bad decision and just be annoying to somebody. But when it's encoded in a system, it affects everybody, en masse. And that really, I suppose, because it's government, we don't tolerate that. But when you look at the search and recommender systems and the amount of really problematic representation of people from all perspectives that are fed to people, I think we've a very high tolerance of that. And I don't know why, because arguably it's more
So we probably have a long way to go before we really understand and appreciate or disappreciate the AI's behavior. I mean, we don't accept a car anymore that has some problems, but now for AI systems, it seems like everybody's accepting anything, but we should stop doing that, I think. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for this perspective, Susan. So I would like then to ask Brendan to the floor and to share his views on the session's topic, but then from the perspective of an industry that is keen on, making business using AI systems. So Brendan, please.
Thanks very much, Frick, and delighted to be here today. So I'm going to be providing a bit of an overview of where the opportunity and the pull is coming from an industry perspective. So I hope to kind of cover today a couple of things, really. What's the expectation from industry? What are the barriers to adoption? And then what is actually kind of the future of adoption? And before I go into it, really to look at the opportunity that we have is, really is that we're looking into a new decade of AI from the industry point of view. And a lot of people are making huge bets on it. The expectation is that local growth for local economies are going to grow through the implementation of AI by 26% over the next decade. And they're talking about 13 trillion euro worth of value being added to the global market as well. And of course, this is all about data. And I think, Susan, you mentioned there, he starts with data. And the question is, the reality is that we're generating more now than we've ever generated. And of course, by 2025, it's going to be huge what is generated daily. And we're going to need AI to how to manage that data that we are creating in those areas. So to kind of give a brief overview, because AI, of course, is huge, as in talking about AI, we can talk about in any type of case or any type of scenario. But what I'm trying to do here is generalize what is industry expecting when they are investing and employing AI into this. So kind of the first area is looking at precision. I think, Frick, you just mentioned about accuracy, is in what's looking forward is actually getting access to those decisions that previously required that you could only get in retrospect or in a forensic point of view. So, for example, within a finance industry, in the finance area, in those places. The second kind of piece is looking at the process, and this is looking at how we can optimize existing processes or activities, but also increasing productivity. So if you think about manufacturing, this is about measuring the parameters to ensure that we are using the limited amount of resources that we have available to get the maximum amount of product out on the other side. But also where people are looking at is the fact that you're able to generate a greater flexibility through the implementation of AI, getting those decisions earlier, but also being able to have that opportunity to automate and to allow the system itself to take over, to react in times when it's very important, such as, as many companies have experienced in the last 24 months and currently ongoing now with the increased challenges in supply chain, but also the challenges that we'll have coming with inflation and the effect that will have. And speaking of which, we kind of go on to the last kind of expectation, which is related to people. So that is one of the key areas that AI can offer support to people, and the people that make up the businesses, that make up the world. Is one area is looking at safety, but also we're talking about changing how people work and the working practices and how they exist, making it more efficient, making it better for people, but also increasing the level of work that is being done rather than menial tasks being automated. And I think solicitors or lawyers out there need to be aware that their jobs, Timon, is one of the ones that is coming for them. And I think it's very important that people are able to understand where human ingenuity and expertise is important and when it is not. And then just a couple of examples I want to go through of kind of showing how it's being implemented now in industry to give you a highlight of what it is that people are looking for. So I have an example here from a company called Agorta, which is based in the Basque Country in Spain, in Gipuzkoa, and they are actually one of these centenary companies. So this company's been around since the 1900s, early 1900s, and they have, and a big part of a bigger group now, but what they've been doing is forging, and they've always been doing forging, but of course, as the years have gone on, they've become more specialized and more specific, and they work completely with the automotive phase. And they run fully automated forging lines. And one of the ways that they're implementing is actually they've put sensors into the forge itself. So if you look in the bottom there, you can see how that piece that is being formed is in conditions where it's 1,200 degrees. You have a lot of scenarios where there's lubricant, where there's dust, where there's very difficult scenarios for the sensorization. And they're able to measure the parameters very specifically and get a real-time analysis of how the production's going. But where they're going beyond that is that the quality, and of course, anyone who is manufacturing components, quality is the key point here. They're able to automate that through 3D visual analysis of the pieces that come out the far side. And what they've done now is implement a machine learning algorithm based on the fact that they can look at what are the results for each batch, what were the conditions in which that batch was forged, and now they're able to actually skip the quality control process because they're going to have confidence in what they're producing meets the quality that's required from the area. Another small example is a company called Tended in Lincoln. This is actually a startup, and they were founded in 2017, and they focus on health and safety through wearables. and to try and highlight the difference of applications you can have in AI, they work very carefully on providing using behavioral science to improve workers' health and safety. So their clients will be based around the railway structure, the construction itself, distribution, if you can imagine warehouses that are miles and miles long, to make sure that people have that area, that people are safe, that they have access to support when it's needed, and that they're able to manage their own safety. And a lot of that is location based. And of course, if you're working in the railways, what happens when you go into a tunnel? So they don't have GPS anymore. And what they're able to do actually is through the data from the accelerometers, based on the algorithms they're working on and the AI, they're able to give accurate precision to where that person is within a tunnel, even though they can't actually see where that person is in that way. And where are the barriers that are being challenging what is the adoption from industry? So the first is the tech. And the reality is accessing the tech. If anyone has studied chemistry before, it's actually a Markovnikov rule, which is he who has more gets more. And that is what is happening here, because we really are kind of beholden to the large scale infrastructure that exists currently within cloud computing. And a lot of industry runs on AWS, Google, IBM, you name it. And that's going to be a barrier that people have, is accessing the right level of tech, but also the knowledge to know what's coming down the road, to be able to have the resources to explore why you should be looking at a different type of AI, what type of AI you should be bringing in, and all those elements there. The second part really is to look at the talent, and this is kind of related to the tech. It's going to create kind of winners and losers here, is that we are in a talent war at the moment, both between big company, small company, between nations, other nations, between the EU, between the US. All of that is actually really the barrier that people have to adopting AI is accessing the right talent who's able to do it in the way. And the final piece, and I think this goes to the previous two speakers' points, is trust. So, you know, we can have no blind faith in AI, especially as industry itself. And the responsibility does lie in industry there in that piece. And I think one of the questions earlier that we'll get into a second later, kind of point there is sometimes people don't know they're using AI. So how is the person supposed to educate themselves about it? But really, the reality is that you have to trust what's being given to you, the decision. And a lot of the implementation of AI in areas such as medicine or areas such as aeronautical is a way of structuring the expertise that's been developed over the years by the doctors and by the pilots. And the pilots have to have the trust in taking that decision that's been given to them and churned out the far side with some transparency in that way as well. And I think as well, we need to talk about security. You know, when we're handing off to data models, we have to be careful that those data models are secure and that they're going to be continue to be secure as we base our whole systems and structures around it. And then finally, within the last piece of trust is an element that needs to be discussed about the move we have towards federated learning. And this transfer learning as we move to sharing data models, and companies need to know that their data is going in and they're getting the same back, but also developing those relationships. And that's something that has to be developed over the coming years is why should I participate in this data model in a federated factor when my competitors are also in it, or also someone who could, like a hyperscaler, use the data against me in some way, because they have a stronger position there. Just a quick note, check out the NGIOT projects, because they're really interesting, because they're actually addressing some of these areas in this piece. And just kind of one of the things I always like to highlight in the talent piece, you can see we have a big problem in Europe actually is trying to keep the talent in Europe and grow it here so that the corporates and the companies that are European are able to develop it within it. And I think some of the other speakers here will experience the same scenario where a lot of PhD students haven't even finished their expertise or developing their expertise, and they're already being offered £150,000 jobs, and they're jumping ship before they've even completed the program. And of course, we need to bring it down to the masters in that area. And the last thing I wanted to finish on really was kind of what are the things that are driving the adoption piece, and going forward, what will need to be in place as we go forward into this decade, as I was talking about. So on the left here, we have a conversation which is more about the tools, and kind of the first piece is bringing the skills level down. So there's a concept called the citizen data scientist, where people know what they want to do, they just don't know how to code it. And it's a question of bringing into low code, no code tools that will enable people to be better able to, who know the business, who know the outcomes, and be able to bring it in there. And that's really important because, of course, you can bring in data scientists, but if they don't understand the business outcomes and they don't have spent the time being trained and understanding what's the point or the purpose behind it, it's actually quite a useless skill to have because the result isn't what is required. The second element related to that is the contextual tools. So to be able to pick those tools up that are related. So for example, if you're talking about an autonomous tractor, drone collaborative partnership within an agricultural setting, you need to have the right tools within that. And the third piece is the off-the-shelf point. Large companies and CTOs, they don't want to be dealing with small providers. They want to be working with one integrator or one large system. So the AI products need to be exactly that, products that you're able to pick and choose, tailor within it, and integrate yourself. And of course, then on the right-hand side is more the elements that we need to look at is the decreasing price of how things are going. And of course, as we move to the edge, we might get a better improvement as we have more intelligence on chip or tiny ML approaches, but also that knowledge. And knowledge is really, really important here because the companies and the leadership need to know, to see what AI can do for them, understand what are the implications, that it's not this panacea, it's this wonderful silver bullet, but actually it has to take into account bias and the elements in that area. And then finally, looking at data as a given. And this is kind of the idea that we are going to be more including more sensors in more areas, but businesses need to have better, almost a good manufacturing practice approach to data, so that when it's feeding into their algorithms, that they are actually secure and clean, not clean we can't guarantee, but that we have good systems in place and good governance in place in those areas. So that was just some inputs there from our industry perspective and kind of thinking of what we need to go forward. And the challenges really is the David and Goliath piece, and also the awareness, the knowledge, but the skills. And I think the skills and the talent and bringing that skills level down and making it more accessible, essentially having a great user interface is the way to go forward, I think, as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Brendan. That's really a different perspective. I think you've presented the usage of AI as, almost just a tool, just a technology, although a quite complicated one, which involves quite a lot of questions that still need to be solved. But it's also really an additional perspective because the first two applications of AI that were implicitly addressed were, I think, applications which are classified as high-risk applications in the upcoming AI regulation, where I think that many of your examples are typically examples of applications of moderate or low-risk applications. So what do you think of the distinction between these classes of high-risk and low-risk AI applications? Do you think that is enough to keep us from having negative effects, or do you think it should be a more precise way? Or what are your opinions on that?
I think it's useful because when you come from industry, you're thinking more in the result. You're thinking more in the outcome and what you can do with it. And I think developing the language or the categorization that is a way to address the risk is probably quite useful in this way. And the way you can have high risk and low risk is a good way for people who are non-experts or non-legal persons who don't have the same background to be able to codify their approaches, but also develop structures that can help the company itself ensure that it doesn't step into the wrong area unintentionally or intentionally. I think we've seen with data protection with the GDPR, that started in 1998 being developed. Companies are still trying to get their head around how they actually sit on the right line. So having that classification is useful, but it does need to be very clear. And I think that with all these things, on paper is one thing, but how do you translate that into practice is the difficulty. I think having, first of all, language about it is useful. I think the problem is that once we get into it, really, we're beginning to blur one process from another, or one business line from another will start to blur, and then you might have creep from high risk into low risk. And I think that's something that's supposed to be addressed.
Yeah. So we really need to take care there. Okay, well, thank you, Brendan. And since the topic of AI regulation already came up, and since, as always, some difficult problems have been put forward by the societal view. Some very interesting topics were presented from the academic point of view. Industry has shown what they are looking at and how they are approaching it. And then, as always, when things are complicated and when impulses are coming from many different directions, it's always up to the government to try to put it all together and to try to come up with some sensibility there so that everybody is still happy. So I'm very happy to have Gianluca here on board, who has tried to work out these complicated things for a long, long time as a member of the JRC. So I'm really curious how you are going to combine these insights plus something of, well, your own as well. So please, Gianluca, I'm very curious.
Yes, thanks, Frick. And well, first of all, let me say that I'm not going to talk on behalf of any government, and definitely not on behalf of the Commission, as you said. And thanks for the invitation. I mean, I realized that about a year ago, when in fact I left the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, I mean, one of the first events I did was exactly the European Big Data Value Forum. Last year was virtually in Germany, and we started discussing some of the issues that now are more central to the policy debate, but also the academic discussion, and civil society is also getting very much involved. So I was, very interested in listening to the previous speakers, and we had already in the pre-discussion a lot of exchanges, because clearly there are a lot of unknowns, some that we know and some that we don't actually know. So basically today I will, building on what the colleagues have said, and in particular, I mean, Brendan already brought us a bit into the future, because in fact we all know that these technologies, so this ensemble of technology that the AI somehow represent, it has a high potential, positive implications could be in our society. Also, we have seen, but also we know the risk. I mean, one of the last work I've done for the JRC, where I was leading research on digital governance and AI in the public sector in particular, was to look in fact to the future. So we've been, I've always been a futurist, and so what we looked at in this particular work was in fact what kind of a future these technologies could bring us, and what policymakers should do, in fact, to make sure that this is a positive, has a positive impact on society. So what we came up with colleagues was that, of course, a lot will depend on how we will regulate or not. So if we will have a laissez-faire approach or more an interventionist one on the digital transformation landscape, that of course has been changing a lot in the last decades, and there is clearly a battle over there at the global level. On the other side, there is, and this was also mentioned by the colleagues, will depend on how we as citizens will actually react, and if this concept of digital sovereignty remains just a rhetoric, let's say policy declaration, or is rather a possibility for all of us to become fully active and not just data subjects. Passive that we cannot control actually really and govern our data in the digital society. And this of course will give us the different option of future. Of course we all believe and hope that the positive one will prevail, so a trusted and open innovation system where we can actually also take advantage of these important technologies. On the other side, we also see that there are risks and also a lot of fear, because also and in fact we did this scenario exactly when the pandemic came in. And if we look at the recent past, coming back from this long-term view into excursion into the future, we see, as Timon mentioned at the very beginning, that in fact we are already witnessing a lot of wrongdoings in the government, also of let's say the bad use, or often not let's say with a bad intention, but clearly the results are often paradoxically creating a lot of problems because, in fact, there's a lot of, let's say, I would say also not full knowledge of what and how to use these very powerful technology. Clearly, automatic decision-making systems are already becoming mainstream in many cases and many areas. Timman mentioned the case of Siri in the Netherlands, but there are many others like Glatz in Denmark, and of course the use of facial recognition system in many public spaces is clearly causing a lot of debate and actually reinforcing, especially in non-democratic regime, the risk that this technology can bring about. So COVID-19 somehow only exacerbated the risk that these systems can bring. And so we have seen all the weaknesses and the challenges that we need to that we have in society and we need to address. And in this respect, I mean, a documentary that came out last year and was, I mean, passed almost unobserved because, of course, we were all dealing with the pandemic. It exactly was titled "We Need to Talk About AI," and this is something that we need to do not only in the technical fora like today, but in general with society, with citizens, involving the civil society and the private sector on the same table. And that's what the government should do, especially if, and on the other side, from an European perspective, if we want to have then a leading role at the international level. So this is what the von der Leyen Commission committed to since the very beginning as a geopolitical commission, as it was declared, and with the idea to, of course, as it has been mentioned now in the recent State of the Union, to invest on these technologies and in the digital transformation and make it from an European perspective. So according to the rules and the values that we have, you know, in a liberal democratic system like the one we are living in Europe, fortunately. And this means also that both in Europe, but let's say worldwide, we need to all together try to find and define a better global governance of artificial intelligence and digital technology in general. This is a white paper I lead author for the Digital Future Society earlier this year, where I look in particular at what I call the governance of, with, and by artificial intelligence, because of course we have to look at the regulatory aspects, so but also how we use this technology within government in particular, and also how sometimes we could eventually be surrounded in the sense of by leaving to the power of this technology to do something that may augment the limitations of us as humans and or taking up on routine tasks, etc. So in this sense, we have to address a number of questions and challenges, some kind of dilemmas for policymakers. Some were already mentioned by Susan and Timman, that of course there are risks in somehow intensifying the power asymmetries and especially you know penalizing citizens that are already in disadvantaged situations, and how in fact the policymakers that often are not you know expert, I mean, provided there are really experts on AI, but how can we address the dilemma, you know, to use this technology to improve the quality of the services, but of course protect the citizens. And then also, and this the pandemic actually emphasized this risk, how even in democratic system like in Europe, we can actually make sure that we don't somehow get into a dystopian future, because these technology are biased and of course are based on not often accurate algorithms and not good quality data. So of course we are all looking for and searching for the Holy Grail, and that's where and I won't talk about the regulation, of course, it's not my role, but this is what someone says that could be a word if the regulatory framework is actually implemented, so after the AI Act, but also if this is supported and combined with you know a number of investment and initiatives that in fact the the revised version of the coordinated plan on AI that the EU member states have adopted on the 21st of April this year will actually be successfully implemented. So this on one side could promote the leading position of Europe that is already has already some excellencies in research and innovation, for instance, but also could reinforce the trust that in fact is lacking when it comes to artificial intelligence, especially in the public sector. In this sense, we have to see the issue of the digital sovereignty from a European perspective, of course, and the global AI governance as two sides of the same coin. Basically, we need, in fact, as I say, to govern artificial intelligence while at the same time governing with and also, let's say, use the potential of artificial intelligence to be governed by these technologies, but also, of course, safeguarding our individual rights, the democratic principles, and make sure that we ensure collective well-being and digital resilience. Or somehow, as Luciano Floridi said in one of his papers, is somehow like the investiture controversy, because it doesn't matter if we are religious or not. I mean, if we are expert of AI or interested in the topic, but depending on who will win this battle, basically we will all be affected all over the world. That's why this issue cannot be just let's say solved at the national or even European level, but must engage the global community. Also, but on the other side, we cannot just let's say be precautionary. Let's say somehow we cannot just use building on Cass Sunstein that was saying that when negative side effects offset the risk avoided, then precaution can be turned on its head. So, I mean, it would be too easy to say, okay, then we ban everything or we don't do everything, because we will lose the potential that, in fact, this technology that is already used anyway could bring to society. For this, it's very important that the debate that is already taking place at international level has a strong, prominent position for the EU as a whole, the Commission and the member states, and that's why. And this, I mean, the reason, or one of the reasons, also I left the JRC was also to lead this initiative that is also an initiative of the European Commission to contribute developing a framework for ethics and trust at the international level, exactly based on universally recognized values, as it was mentioned before. And through this activity that we are also, of course, working in collaboration with some of the like-minded countries, starting with Australia, Canada, and Japan, to also share experiences and better understand the challenges. We have launched the initiatives together with the Global Policy.ai at the recent conference in Slovenia in September. And the idea is to work with a number of multilateral fora within the contributing to multilateral fora to make sure that the European perspective is let's say, promoted, and the European research and industry is also contributing to the debate. And so to conclude, just as I also have another hat that I wanted to share, because it was mentioned, especially by the last speaker, the need to also have an interdisciplinary approach to this, how we manage the technology and within the different aspects, different areas, let's say, different application areas. And in this sense, we have launched earlier this year, also funded by the Commission, the AI for Gov Master, the first master on AI for public services, with the idea exactly to forge functional specialists, as we say. So people that have knowledge of artificial intelligence, but also have experience and work in the public sector or with the public sector. So to make sure that, the risk also, because I'm sure Frick will ask about the risk, will be addressed not only from the technical side, but also from the application side, so that we can guarantee use of this technology in society is beneficial to all citizens. So, so I stop here, and of course, thank you. And here you have also the contacts of this initiative I mentioned.
Excellent, thank you, Gianluca. you not only reminded us of the role that governments play in terms of, for instance, legislation, but you also highlighted the international dimension. And there was, well, one remark that stood out for me, especially also that you said that the sovereignty is very important, because whoever wins the race for sovereignty, or the big platforms, the winner takes all part, that they will also have much more impact and much more power than all of the others combined. And I think this is something to keep in mind, and steps are being taken currently, but I think we still need to take care of that as well, this reality.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, I mean, there are, well, you know, the Slovenian minister announced recently the adoption, or at least the agreement on the mandate of the Data Governance Act and the Digital Service and Digital Market Access. So these are the first steps exactly in that direction, combined with the, with the AI package. I mean, we will see how this will be then adopted. There is discussion with the different institutions, and civil society is playing an important role. So this will give us, an idea of how we will, let's say, shape this landscape that we said at the beginning is so important for then, for building, shaping the future that we would like to see.
Yeah, thank you. I think, now we've had four perspectives, quite different, maybe at some points disagreeing or overlapping. There's also questions from the audience, at least one very intriguing one. So I'd like to ask Joachim, please, Joachim, take the floor and, see what we got when we ask some difficult questions from all these four perspectives.
Yes, thank you, Freek, indeed. And I think we would like to invite all our speakers also to join and switch on the cameras, because we now will have an open discussion. We'll just see how it goes along. We have some questions from the audience, and I think there's also opportunity for you to basically reflect on what the other speakers have been saying, if something popped out for you. So feel free to also take that opportunity. But I would like to start with the first question from the audience. Adrian is asking to the panel, in your opinion, is there sufficient amount of emotional intelligence utilized in the development of AI that impacts upon people's lives? So who would like to reflect on that?
I can come in here.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I think the short answer to that is no at present. I think the AI that's being rolled out and used at the moment is machine learning. It's gathering, spotting patterns in data and using that to make predictions, and there's not much emotional intelligence, but I think it's an essential aspect of intelligence, so it has to be integrated, like either through human oversight in the whole process, or into the algorithms themselves, and there's work ongoing on all those areas to encode values of fairness and concepts like that within the algorithms themselves.
Yes, thank you. And just to follow up on that, the fact that we don't currently have this, is that because of technological limitations, or rather, let's say, the fact that we're just not aware of it, not fully appreciate also those aspects?
I think we don't definitely not have it. I mean, there are aspects, there's ethical innovations, and there's oversight, there's a lot going on, but there's a lot to do, I think, yeah. And part of that is technical innovation, and part of that is human in the loop. There's ways of coming at this from and all sorts. Part of it is data curation that is, it's not, yeah. So there's all sorts of aspects involved, and there's work going on, definitely.
Yes, thank you. Any of the other speakers would like to respond?
Maybe a very quick issue. I mean, this is, I mean, I'm not a technical person, but I mean, this is somehow what reflects the debate on, you know, the super AI or the general AI that a lot of people are dreaming of, and what is in reality the use of AI. As Susan said today, says just now that, you know, today we see only narrow AI, very, you know, limited use of applications. Of course, research is exploring, and I was reading this morning, there are some kind of breakthrough happening also on AI, especially in that direction, because this will make a big difference. But you know, the dream of singularity that a lot of people has been dreaming of for many years, I mean, I don't see this is happening tomorrow. But it's true that also probably, and this is where also the research community should perhaps try to coordinate better. There are a lot of results and applications that may be further scale up, and then maybe where in fact the different perspective that I think the idea of Frick was to have the quadruple helix approach, so should be put together so that then maybe this could be experimented, maybe in a controlled sandbox control environment like sandbox. So this then we could have some breakthrough maybe quicker than otherwise waiting for the singularity dream to arrive by itself.
Yeah, so you're advocating for regulated singularity in a way.
I think if I can jump in just to pick up on kind of the piece that the here and now is that we're applying AI in different contexts, and it's very much a fragmented piece, and it's growing in that way. So the idea of trying to embed ethics into the tech side of things is probably a fair bit off, but I think the most immediate scenario that we are seeing in terms of application and deployment is in that collaborative human in the loop element, where the human gets to reject the decision that's been proposed to them or what's been given to them in those ways, and that allows that transparency through. But I think for us at the moment, we're way off in terms of deployment from reaching, as you say, that singularity or that kind of ethics embedded or emotional intelligence. Because I think within industry, one of the biggest challenges we have is that we're dealing with people. We're not actually dealing with machines. You know, the machines is one piece, but you have a whole staff that is around that, and people who are having to work with these machines, and the engineers and the people and all that. So we have to always bring that into account. And I think the immediate scenario is allowing the human in the loop element, and also allowing the human to reject what's been given to them by it, and build up that confidence as it goes on in those ways.
Yeah, thank you. Timon, you also would like to respond?
Yeah, I think perhaps we should be happy that, you know, that there's something that sets us humans apart from AI. So there's might also, with the whole singularity, isn't the fundamental assumption underlying this that emotions can be digitized, and isn't that very questionable in itself, to say that emotions are binary? There was a question for Mark Zuckerberg during a Q&A of Stephen Hawking, where he asked Mark Zuckerberg, what are you actually looking for? What is the fundamental, like, what is the thing that you would want to find out? And then his answer was, I would like to know whether there's a mathematical model underlying human relationships, which has been sort of, you know, like dubbed as a bit of a pun, the universal love theory. And you can ask the question like whether that is, you know, it's sort of this engineer's dream that even that aspect of humanity is it can be caught in scientific theory. And there are, like, from a scientific perspective, there are many questions and objections to be made there. That's my only point.
Yes, we're definitely not there yet, but it's good to be aware of those aspects. I'd like to move on to another question for you people in the panel. We do have the the European AI regulations coming up, and also the coordination plan, as Gianluca mentioned. Now, of course, I think you're all aware of this, but in your opinion, is this sufficient? Is it sufficiently sort of capturing the risk and challenges that we are seeing? What would you think of that?
No. Sorry, to give a very quick answer to that, From my perspective, the whole AI regulation, which in the like in the wording verse, it says some things about fundamental rights, but if you read the entire contents of the regulation, it's really about governance, and it doesn't set any essential limits on the deployment of AI. So it is. It has some fundamental rights like interweaving through it, but like substantially, it doesn't offer anything on fundamental rights.
Okay. Anybody else would like to respond to that?
Well, I can go. I mean, of course, I won't, as I said, I won't discuss about the regulation, although, I mean, also there's a big debate on that. There was this recent position paper by a lot of civil society organizations. I guess Timon is fully aware, and exactly, raising some of these issues that perhaps there could be a stronger, let's say, link with the protection of fundamental rights. There is also the different views in the member states, but also in the different institutions. So the parliament has also other, there are different opinions, and now it was announced, I think yesterday, several committees of the European Parliament will be involved in the review of the AI Act. So this will open the discussion in different areas, of course. Now, I also was involved, since now I'm independent, in a study for the European Parliament, requested by the Parliament, exactly to review the overall digital decade strategy of the Commission. So because all the assumption on the, how we reach this strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty is based on a number of pillars, including the AI, but not only, of course, there are all the data governance issue, the industry and the research pillars that should be reinforced. So all in all, and colleagues, I'm not a modeler reader, so my colleagues made a Monte Carlo simulation with the data available for the digital compass, and I mean, there's still a lot to be done, I think, also in terms of investments, and especially in some areas that we may not associate immediately to the AI field, but that is exactly on the government side. So if we don't make, let's say, our own, if we don't fix our own, so if we don't do our homework, and we have government really functioning, we cannot really then go outside of Europe and lead the world. So we need to really make sure that this is done. And then, of course, there are a lot of issues linked to the how we use the AI, and that's perhaps maybe others can comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. Susan or Brendan, would you like to respond?
Just kind of a question, more about the process, less about the content. But the reality is if we spend too long in Europe talking about this regulation and spending our process, we're going to get outcompeted anyway, as in, like happened previously, other companies are going to come in with a stronger positioning and a stronger product that people are going to want to adopt, regardless of how well they treat their data or how well the data is being done. So there needs to be a balance there and a care taken that we're creating structures. And of course, from an industry point of view, what you want to be looking at is how can I be compliant, but also how can I have that freedom to operate that does allow that movement of progression, because we kind of in Europe have this concept of looking inwards the whole time, and we need to look a bit more outwards and keep an eye on what's going outside of Europe, because if we're going charging around with a piece of paper in our hands, we might get, we have this piece of paper, but people might be laughing at us behind our back because they've already sorted it out in their different areas, and that will creep its way through into people who use, because at the end of the day, as we've all seen with the apps and with Facebook and all these social media scenarios, ease of use is one of the key things that drives adoption, and people will pick something that is easier to use over something that might be safer. And of course, we can argue that back and forth, but I think it's something just to keep in mind, that the speed at which we reach an agreement is kind of done is better than perfect, is often something that needs to be brought into these conversations.
Yeah, so you're identifying the risk that we try to do it right, but then we might be a little bit too slow, and countries outside Europe might actually overtake us.
Yeah. Exactly. And European companies will be sitting there going, oh, we need to be careful because we've got this act coming up and we're thinking and the focus is there. And by the time it comes out, it'll all be too late anyway. So we just need to be careful on that.
Yeah. Susan, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd agree that sometimes perfection is the enemy of the good, and especially in something like AI where it's moving so fast. How do you regulate for something that moves that fast? But I think the EU regulations are ambitious, and I think they're great. And I love the carving a third way. You know, you have, you know, you definitely have to look outwards, but you also have to say within the EU, here's our vision. And I think it's doing well to carve out that different kind of a vision, and avoiding the competing with visions that we don't want to pursue, you know. Yeah, so I think the approach is good. I think it's marks out the high risk areas really well, you know, and it's strong. It's recommending outright bans of certain technologies. So I think I'm certainly a big fan of this as the proposed regulations. I think it's Europe at its best in a way, you know. Like, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Perfect. It's pretty great, I think, you know.
Thanks all for all your responses. I see Freek popping in, presumably telling us that we have reached the end of the session.
Yeah, indeed. I think that we, especially the last topic, that we could go on for some time, because I heard some different opinions on the proposed AI regulation. I think, Tijmen saying, well, there's not even a glimpse of fundamental rights in it, while Susan is saying, well, it's a very good example of what we are capable of in Europe, while the others had somewhere in between positions. So we could continue our discussion a little bit more, but there is a scheduled end time of 3 o'clock, which is now. Plus it's a Friday afternoon. So I also think that many people in the audience are slowly starting to think of the weekend. But I must say, for this moment, I'm really energized with your contributions. I'm really very much impressed by the different perspectives that were offered. And I thought that I had more or less a grasp of the topic itself, but you really, all of you, offered some very good new insights, at least for me. So probably for some people in the audience, this will also count as well. So I would like to thank you very, very much for finalizing this interesting European Big Data Value Forum 2021. Maybe having the opportunity to talk to you again, maybe at a future edition of EBDVF, and then a physical one. I really look forward to shaking hands again. But for now, we do it in the way that we adopted in the last 1.5 years, by waving goodbye, thanking you again, and hope to see you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.